Hi,
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, Akanksha. So good to see you.
Likewise, happy Easter. I know, I don't know if many people celebrate, but it's Easter today.
It's a good Friday. We have you with us, so that in itself is a good Friday.
Thank you so much. So nice to be here. I had so
Yep.
much fun the other time I presented. Like, your organization is doing such great work, so I'm delighted to be here.
No, and we're equally excited to be having somebody who's so young who's contesting for the highest office in the United Nations. We keep talking about the UN, and it's so very nice to see a young person challenging status quo. So delighted to be able to do this with you. You need little introduction, given the fact that you're all over plastered, all over all different forms of media, right from the New York Times to now Indian television. You're everywhere. But for the few who don't know her, she's basically running for the highest office in the United Nations, the office of the UN Secretary General. She's only 35 years old, though looks younger, and therefore gives me a complex at times. Studied at Columbia University and has a fair amount of experience about the UN. But what I like the most about her is the fact that she's challenging status quo. She's basically going against the norm, and she's actually making statements which make people sit up and take notice. So it's a pleasure to be able to do this with you, Akanksha Arora, and welcome to India's international movement to United Nations.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's just a pleasure to be speaking with you and all the great work that everyone involved with this association does. And I'm so glad there's so many people joining who are inspired to be reforming the UN. And I'm looking forward to this discussion a lot.
No, and so am I. And but let me first start with this is not a conventional BBC Heart Talk interview that you're doing, but let me actually ask you the difficult question. See, I really personally also admire the vision of the UN, and since the last 19 years, I did my first MUN conference in 2002. So the last 19 years have been quite enamored and quite wowed by the concept of what the UN stands for, which is essentially a world without borders, which is equality for all, and so on and so forth. But at the same point in time, don't you think that it is a place which is run on the wishes and the whims and fancies of a few, that the permanent five, and this is what I've come to realize, the permanent five kind of dictate everything that happens in the United Nations. You, whether it be in the Security Council or even otherwise, even if you want to make a simple reform, at the end of the day, if you've not got consensus of the permanent five, you're not being able to make some headway. So do you really think that the United Nations is effective, given the fact that everything needs to be run by these five nations? And when it's against their interests, don't you think it becomes a difficult thing? Even in an MUN competition, when you've got the P5 having a veto, then everyone's vetoing a resolution. So in the actual UN, when you've got 293 vetoes in the last, since the concept of the veto started, don't you think it's becoming a little too difficult in order to implement real change? Your thoughts?
So a bit of an education exercise first. There are two UNs. A lot of people don't know about it. And one UN is the one that makes decisions. There's one UN that implements decision, and that is 75% of the UN that is just hidden from the world. It's like a tip of a iceberg, the decision making and implementation. So let me give you an example on why implementation is so important. When COVID happened, what was the first thing all countries did? They passed a decision to make a vaccine. That's called a decision making. Would you call it success if just because a decision is passed, like COVID is conquered? Not really, right? You've just passed a decision. Even when a vaccine is made, is that success? Not really. Because we're all going through COVID ourselves, we would only call it success when it's administered in our arms, when we're able to travel freely, we're able to meet people. That is success. Implementation is success. The same goes for the UN. The UN serves the most vulnerable, and not people like you and I, not people who are on social media to even hear about the UN, not people who are think tanks to talk about the UN. It doesn't serve that population. So those it's supposed to serve are not even heard or seen by anyone. So all that's seen is the decision making. And they're like, that's the UN, that's the UN. But that's just 25% of the UN. 75% is implementation. So it's very critical to understand that tip of the iceberg is not the whole iceberg. And the job of the UN was to serve people, which it's not doing today. But I will answer your question on this decision-making aspect and the vetoes. How does it inhibit a good process? So after League of Nations, when they converted to UN Charter, they made Security Council with the veto power. But they limited the discussions that Security Council could have only on peace and security matters. There are so many other topics that are discussed in the General Assembly, in the Economic and Social Commission, in the Human Rights Council each and every day. And there you don't have a veto. General Assembly has 6 committees. They passed almost 300 plus resolutions each year. ECOSOC has so many committees. Sustainable Development Goals was a result of ECOSOC. So I feel what's important to realize is that Security Council is a small purview. And I agree with you on that, that the veto power is used in what serves those countries best, and it should be minimized as many ways possible. But let's not minimize the bigger issue, where we're not implementing. In Libya is classic example. When the when Arab Spring happened in 2010 in Tunisia, when this farmer set himself on fire, Libya, it passed to Libya, and Gaddafi's like, if you go against me, I'm going to kill each one of you in your house. Like, people thought that this was a genocide coming. We've got to act. Look where we are now. Where is decision making was all there. It's implementation. So I think, Rishabh, it's critical. We introduce this to your students, to MUNs, and everyone in the world. Implementation is critical, and that's what's important for each one of us when it's our own lives or the lives of our loved ones.
Fair. But implementation is important, and I concede to that. But at the same point in time, if you don't have a decision, then how do you implement the decision? So basically, if you don't have a vaccine, how do you actually implement it? Let me just quickly, you mentioned about Libya, and I'm all for the concept of what the UN stands for again and again. That's what I'm mentioning. Is you prevented a lot of things that could have gone wrong or amiss. But let me also take you to the Rwandan genocide of '94. Let me also take you at the same point in time to Srebrenica. Let me take you to what happened with Iraq. Let me take you to so many of these instances which are not peace and security, like the Uyghur Muslims issue, which is in case of human rights, where we see on a day-to-day basis that there are people who are being deprived of basic human rights as declared in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And even in the home country that you live in, which is Canada, they've passed in your House of Commons a law, a resolution to the effect that basically condemns the actions of what is currently happening in China. But when you look at the United Nations, there is not a single piece of paper which condemns or questions China when it comes to the Uyghur Muslim issue. Now, you said that it's so important for the Permanent Five and it's restricted to the Security Council. Actually, a small check on that. Isn't the P5 under powers of the P5 also going to interfere when it comes to the General Assembly and the other organs as well? The reason I mentioned this is, for any reform in the General Assembly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you need consensus from the Permanent Five. When you've got 22% of your budget funded by one particular country, then at the end of the day, whether they have the veto or they don't have the veto. So I'm saying, I'm not just blaming the Permanent Five. All that I'm saying is the structure, the way the UN has been made. Do you think that it can actually have any difference on ground in terms of implementation when actually to make the vaccine take so long because everyone's squibbling and quarreling, and the real issues like the Rohingya Muslims, which is very close to home in India, and we see so very many of them displaced. And many of these 1,700, some of them are from northeast of India, and I can tell you that we see this in real time. So not just you and me on this Instagram live, because some of these people actually see these issues, and the United Nations fails to act, whether in India or whether it be in Geneva or New York. Your thoughts?
So I think there's so much wisdom packed in what you just said. So let me just break it down into a few things. And coming back to this General Assembly, the power of five, in that I have sat through meetings where it's a consensus based. They only have one vote by the end of the day. Like, they don't have a veto when it comes to those decisions around any of the topics that you mentioned outside peace and security. So what they have to then do is they have to convince their allies, which is what diplomacy and negotiation is all about. So they are able to do that based on their own influence and financial power in the world, but not because of the veto ability. So I think it's important that it does happen, that they are significant, but there's still one vote. I have sat in meetings where I've actually seen smaller countries challenge them and get their point across, because it then depends on who's able to build a coalition. So that's just something I would say. And I agree with all the points you're saying, that, and I give it a number. I say it's 25%. that decision is, but 75% is still there. So, and I think it's like, it's unfortunate that we don't have universities teaching that. We have policy schools, we have diplomacy classes, we have negotiation. We don't have anyone implementation. And that's something that in my candidacy, since I've announced, do you know what's interesting? So when I did decide to run for Secretary General, it was after I concluded the reforms of the UN. And I realized that after 2 years, it was a reshuffle. We've had 9 Secretary Generals and 8 reforms. They've all been same. And I didn't want to believe it, but I came to the sad realization. And I tried my best to change the system. But then I was like, you know what? I believe in the system. I want the system to be alive for 100 more years or 1,000 more years. But let's make it work. And I wanted to run for the UN. So I invested all my time in learning every resolution, every fact, all organs, and what that vision for me would be. No one is challenging me on that. You know what's interesting? In my 2 years, when I used to imagine having these conversations about my candidacy, I was like, oh my God, they might question me on this. I need to learn all the facts. I need to get everything right. No one is challenging me on facts because I'm right. So we all agree on what the problems are. We all agree on the way forward. It's, I think it's just, well, we don't agree on the way forward, but we all agree that there's something wrong, something different, something to be done about the system. And my job in the last few weeks I've learned is to arouse sympathy and empathy in people. Like, you know what, just because you're not going through it, you have to prioritize the suffering of others and do it. And I don't know if I shared this example with you previously, but I'll just tell you. So when I was at the UN, I went to Africa for a trip.
Right.
And when I was in Africa, on the weekend, I saw this child eating mud. And it was such a devastating image to see, like, this little girl who has no other option but to eat mud. And I asked people around it, does she relate it to them? And I didn't get a response. So all I could do at that time was give cash and food. And then I asked a senior official, like, why is that happening? And he said, you know, mud is good for children. It has iron. So it doesn't matter decision-making, implementation. You need to be a morally conscious person to be able to work in this field and to take care of people as well. So I think that's something I've noticed is more important than the discussion around decision-making.
Fair. You need to be a person who is morally conscious, and I only wish that 7 billion people become as morally conscious as you are, that you are spreading awareness about something like this. But then again, coming back and touching upon this, because I think it's very important for also viewers to understand, and that's why probably we've even, firsthand after working with the UN on numerous projects, both in India and internationally, we've kind of realized that up until the time, and this is when it comes specifically to reform, like you said, in the General Assembly, one person has one vote, right? But at the end of the day, when you want to reform something in the United Nations systems, and you spoke about, the 8 reforms that you've seen, the reform that you've just seen. But whenever you want to reform something, like say, for example, hypothetically reforming the Security Council, then don't you, and this is across the board, not just the Security Council, but all your organs, don't you need consensus from the permanent 5?
Correct. You do.
So does this render, and so just to then build on to that, does this render the UN Secretary General and the staff members, like, I really admire the fact, and I do really sincerely hope that, in a way that there are people such as you who actually reach the highest office, because you will be changing status quo, not like how some people after reaching the position think about whether they want to or not, but you made your stance very clear, and I really appreciate that. I think since reform started with Kofi Annan, I mean, I see so much in the study that I have done and the statements that you're giving. There's so much of similarity. But then again, the problem is a strong United Nations Secretary General candidate something that 193 countries wants? Do countries actually want a candidate who speaks his or her mind? Because the UN is, of course, 2 things. One is the 7 billion people that it hopes to represent. The second is the 193 countries that are jostling for power. In that, do you think that countries are looking for a candidate who's 35, who speaks her mind? And I'm asking you this, it'll stay between the 1,700 people who are watching. But do you think countries are going to come eventually vote for you?
I think so. I absolutely think so. And the reason I say that is because we are now entering a new world order after COVID. The world will not be the same again. And this new world order has made sure that all of us are taking care of each other and are sympathetic and are ensuring that our institutions are serving. Like last summer with BLM, we've challenged institutions when they're not serving. We've challenged status quo. We've challenged discrimination and any form of difference that people have. So what this candidacy is doing is shedding to light that those 7 billion are more than 193. And the 193 represent the 7 billion that I honestly think that they are supportive. I've received informal comments from a lot of people who work in the missions to say, you know, we fully support you. We're so thrilled that this election, we will have a real choice. And I think my vision is something that they're extremely concerned, like passionate about as well. So my vision is to address the growing refugee displaced people crisis. There are 85 million of those today, and these are people who are not under anyone's jurisdiction. Okay. And we really need to take care of their humanitarian needs. When it comes to development, over the last 40 years, we've tried trickle-down economics. Is, you know, if you just count every resource that goes from like private sector, we're talking about a ballpark of 1 trillion annually that gets invested in development. Not just through the UN, but just if you add the whole ecosystem. And we're not seeing the results. So we need to do things creatively and differently, and that is giving people internet and education. And climate change, something that our generation and perhaps the entire world is passionate about, right? How much do you think for every dollar UN receives goes into nature-based solutions that will actually combat climate change?
Well,
15 cents.
Wow. Wow.
1.5. Everything else is holding reports, conferences, writing reports. And so that is, I think, what member states are seeing, that, you know, we care. We care about the UN. We care about the world. We need a good leader. And I think it goes back to the way our charter defines the Secretary General, Chief Administrative Officer, that they need an action person here. Yeah.
No, fair, but see, I'm all for a multilateral platform that tries to do good, and I think the United Nations is attempting to do that. But then again, the very fundamentals of the UN. Now, whether you look at the League of Nations and then the formation of the UN and in 1945, and the fact that, you know, that it was a few powers that actually came together, and the power structure of the UN, which again I'm coming back to, it lies with only 5 nations, which is why it sometimes does happen that you are not actually it does happen in today's geopolitical scenario that when it comes to nations across, you're not necessarily you're not representative of the power structure that exists today. Like, for example, Brazil as a nation has lifted about 22 million people out of poverty in the last few years. India has 600 million young people below the age of 35. Now we've got as many young people who are educated and literate as much as the total population of the P4 out of the P5 minus China, which basically means if you don't have countries such as these, or Japan, you don't have countries such as these contributing to the world stage. And why should we contribute to a concept? And this is my question as an Indian. And as an educated Indian who's gone to these different countries and in a small way understood, not as much as you, but how the international power structure works. You've got 5 countries who have, you know, formed the United Nations for purposes where they puppet the UN, and sorry to say, but puppet the UN Secretary General in a way that when it comes to any real significant change on ground, including the SDGs, which I really admire for setting about holistic, you know, aims per se. But these are paper documents which don't have real targets. And when you look at the 100+ targets that have been put down, 104, 107 targets, if you remove SDG 17, you can actually say that, you know, all of these targets are quite utopian in the fact that it's basically a wish list to a fairy godmother, more than quite technically something that can happen, which is what I'm coming to. The question is that, don't you think the UN is representative of 1945 and not of 2021? And that the fact that powers that are controlling the UN today will not give up, why would they give up a high seat at a table which is the table of power, so to say, to a country which is a developing nation, or a country which, you know, like Japan, which is long overdue to get its place, rightful place under the sun? Do you think that a change is possible?
In decision making, it rests with them. I think for me, I can talk about the change in the implementation. It's the same thing. The powers be need to be open to a new generation to come in, to new ideas to come in. So it's interesting that even the leadership of implementation bodies doesn't represent the world, which is half of the world is women. Majority are youth. We are also not represented in the implementation side. So I think that's the battle I can fight. And that's the battle that I am here for, to make a difference in the world and to usher our generation. Because our generation is someone that's made huge contributions everywhere in the world. But when it comes to international organizations, we're given something called visitation rights, but not participation rights. And I hope that that's something that our audience, like on this call, on this live, will take away. Is that you are the future of the world. You need to own up to it. You need to have the courage, the audacity to just do what you think is right and what will make a difference in the world. And I really hope that that's what this candidacy can bring the conversation to. Not just the P5, which I know a lot of people do, like exact same arguments, Rishabh, apply to this side too. Is that the leadership is not representative. The average age of UN leadership is 62. The average age of the world is 30. Half of them are women. Majority leadership is men. So let's bring diversity in there too, something that's easily manageable than the other structures.
No, I completely agree with the fact that, you know, we should not focus on the 25% and we should also focus on the 75%. The problem, Akanksha, out here is, and this is why I have a problem with behemoths or multilateral organizations such as the UN, is when we started, and I'll give you an anecdote from my own personal experience. When we started, and it was not me, but it was a largest team of young people in India. We had about 19 or 20 MUN conferences. Today in India, there are about 29,000 MUN conferences, according to leading dailies. Now, we spread it in about 220 cities. But what I see is when I see them simulating the United Nations, I see the same problems that you would on the administrative side face. Because like I said, like in your own words, if you don't have a vaccine, how are you going to vaccinate? Basically, if you don't have a resolution on Sri Lanka, then how are you going to actually bring about change? And in so many cases, you have resolutions on countries, like in case of Israel. You've got resolutions on countries, and Israel's been condemned 45 times, but there's nothing that's happened. 85% of Palestine, as it existed, since the time of the UN till date, you've got the same problem again and again. And my problem is this, that the 75%, which rests on the 25%, can do very little, which is why we, even in the acronym, and there's nothing against the United Nations, I think it's a fantastic organization when it comes to the vision of the UN. But isn't it time for young people to look outside the UN as well and try to bring about change, irrespective of whether we support democracy or communism? At the end of the day, like you said, you need to have a moral conscience. And if you have a Fidel Castro looking after his population, not that he did or that he didn't, but if you have a Fidel Castro looking after his population, or whether it is President Joe Biden, it shouldn't really matter. And the problem with the UN is we're yet stuck on the 25% or the 75%. And some of my friends work in the UN. Some people who've gone from working in the UN, and they're frustrated at the fact that, you know, there's very little that actually happens. And statistics such as the one that you give, which is like, you know, on climate change, and I do believe it's just 26 cents or something that actually gets implemented in terms of
29
cents that actually gets implemented. So I mean, so things like that. And at the end of the day, so don't you think it's better to look even outside the United Nations to try to form something like the Concert of Europe? Your thoughts on, should the UN be similar to the Concert of Europe, or do you think the UN in its existing way should be focused towards more reform and that you can bring about that reform?
I think I'll go with the second one, that I do believe we shouldn't give up on the UN. But with that said, I also think that people should participate in every way they can. So I just released an open invitation to the world to be part of, for me to write my vision statement to the UN. So on April 30th, I have to submit my vision for the UN. And I sent an open invitation to everyone who wants to be part of it. There's a Google Docs link. You can message me on Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. And I would put you in one of the 14 work streams. We have technology, education, youth unemployment, like health. I do want to talk about mental health a lot in that as well. So I think to everyone on this call and everyone in your community, there is an open invite. Please don't give up yet. Let's crowdsource all the great ideas and put them forward. And I'm sure we will be able to usher a UN into the 21st century that represents the needs of nations and the people.
No, fair, and I'm not saying that one should give up on the United Nations. In fact, like I said, I believe very strongly in the fact that the UN can bring about change. The only problem is that it's not, and that's why let me take this question once again and ask you this. Don't you think that the power structures should be changed in a way? If you were United Nations Secretary General, would you push for something that is similar to the Concert of Europe, or do you think that hypothetically, if the 193 countries go ahead and vote, and I really hope that things like that actually happen, that a fairy tale does come along and it does become true. But do you think then a power structure like the Concert of Europe is more doable?
My agenda as Secretary General is to focus on the implementation and get that right and build the trust and credibility of the UN, that all the changes naturally will come through. So yes, I definitely believe that once you start seeing the results, the trust and credibility is restored, that the discussion around decision making can be enhanced in a more fruitful way. Like right now, there's no appetite for change because you haven't seen any result. You're like, even if we change from A to B, well, what difference will happen? So show them the tangible results, and then there'll be an appetite to even consider things differently.
Okay, one step at a time. And but let me take you to another very interesting aspect, which is the SDGs. And I've grown up reading.
Is this a half-hour live or how long? The reason I say that is I have a 9:30 interview in 3 minutes.
It's 7:15 India time. That's what I was told. But that's basically 17 minutes from now.
Okay. Okay, if we can cut that in half, that would be great, because I have another interview that I'm late for. Sorry.
No stress. Let me ask you then this question. This is something that I've been wanting to ask people in the UN, and I ask them a lot in India. But of course, sometimes they give answers and sometimes they don't. The SDGs, they're decorated. Every school puts them up. Every university puts them up. Every corporate puts them up. But my problem with the SDGs, I think they're great documents. I think it's a utopian wish list that, if we can go through 1 to 16, one after the other, that's fantastic. But don't you think that they are contradictory in nature as well? And the reason why I say this is you've got SDG 2, which talks about zero hunger. But at the same point in time, you've got ecological balance and balance for the oceans when it comes to maintaining in, I think, SDG 14 or 15 you talk about oceans in balance in the ocean. Problem with this is that you're focusing too much, some are self-contradictory, and you're focusing sometimes too much on on the big words like zero hunger, but you're not dealing with issues such as food sovereignty. Now, shouldn't it be termed, the SDG 2, shouldn't it be termed more like food sovereignty in comparison to food hunger? Your thoughts? And then I'll go to the last.
Yeah, I actually agree with you. You made a very good observation that that some of them need to be thought through a bit more. And in terms of your specific point around food sovereignty and stuff, I think what it is critical. Like, you'd be surprised a country like America has a lot of food insecurity, which means that there is no access to grocery store to a lot of people, that they have to rely on pantry-like items. So food sovereignty is critical, but at the same time, we have to preserve environment then. That you have to make sure that climate is addressed and you're taking care of that. So I think my response to that question would be, all of them are important, but some are more important than the other. Prioritization is critical. Technology and innovation needs to be ushered in so we can get things done in a faster and more inclusive manner.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that you think that there is always scope and room for improvement. But
yes.
Okay, let me ask this, because this has been doing a lot of rounds for people who when I told them saying I'm having this conversation, many of them asked me saying, Rishabh, and I'm going to ask you this question as well. They said, what is Akanksha's experience when it comes to the United Nations? She's worked for about 4 to 5 years in the UN, but she has limited experience when it comes to foreign policy. She's got limited experience when it comes to student politics. And also, she's not dealt with administration at any level as such, apart from the capacity of an auditor to the UN. So does she make for the right candidate? What would you say to people? Because this last part is the reason I'm asking this is because this is a question that a lot of people in different governments would probably at some point in time, I think, at least would discuss, saying, why should we vote for a 34-year-old candidate who has little to no experience when it comes to foreign policy, and so also, like I said, in a smaller context, student politics?
Yes. So there, like I said, there are two aspects to the UN, the decision-making and the implementation. The decision-making aspect, which does require the skills of diplomacy and international relations, I have that through my work within the UN. You cannot survive UN 4 years without diplomatically dealing with your colleagues, dealing with the decision-making bodies. And I think that inside experience of understanding the culture on how things work is an absolute asset. Just because I wrote the talking points for the person who said it, doesn't mean I don't have the experience. I was the script writer behind all those talking points. So so there is an experience in there. It's just different than what the other party has. And I think that's something to address. Our generation will always be different than the generation before us. We cannot be compared with the same X number of metrics. We are different. We will always be different. And if we compare with that metric, then we will never rise up. Then you will always have the same thing, doing things the same way. And the challenge with our generation has proven to be leaders when it comes to political engagement and mobilizing youth. Greta, the first climate conference happened in 1972. Greta came along and mobilized. So that is the power of my generation. So to hold me to compare to the current Secretary General, of course we're different. My experiences are relevant to the job. The job is to actually be able to get things done. And that is something I have to take from A to Z, because I bring with myself employee perspective on what it takes to why things are not being able to get done. And that's something that decision making doesn't have. So I have the right experience for the right time and the right attitude to do this. You know, if a senior leader of the UN is telling me mud is good for children, it has iron, I don't think that's a leadership that can usher change, usher even empathy or prioritization to the needs of the people. So I absolutely have all the experiences needed. And when it comes to diplomacy, it's interesting. The most important skill set is listening. Listening to all different perspectives, and then coming to and giving them a platform to express that, and then coming to a consensus-based decision, and then earning their trust by being able to implement on that. Words are only good when your skin is not in the game, when that COVID doesn't attack you. So those are the skill sets that I have, and that represents the people of the world.
Very well said. It's always better when COVID is not attacking you, but I think a failed UN is going to attack all of us. And if we have a failure in the systems and the working of the United Nations, God forbid we have the Third World War, and it's written in history books that the United Nations couldn't stop it. But it was a pleasure speaking with you. And before I let you go, I must ask you this very important question. This is a make or break. If you answer this correctly, believe me, all the 193 nations will vote for you.
Okay.
Is it Gryffindor or is it Slytherin?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It's unfortunate. No, I actually think it's Gryffindor for sure.
This is one that's going to make your career or break your career. So be careful.
Yes. I think it's Gryffindor. The Sorting Hat told me.
And then the Sorting Hat puts us wherever we want to eventually. So I sincerely hope that all, and I must commend you once again for the brave step that you've taken in order to challenge a system despite being a part of a system. And I think that in itself speaks volumes of, like you said, a generation of young leaders who the world is looking up to. The very best of luck for all your endeavors, and thank you so much for spending time and doing this.
Thank you so much, and have a great weekend. Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Okay, so that was fantastic. It was very nice chatting with young people who are trying to bring about change. The question and the problem, however, is how much change can you bring about in a system which doesn't allow you to bring about any change? Now, that's going to be something that we should wait and watch. With our dealings with the United Nations, of course, we've learned a lot. And like I've said, that irrespective of the UN, irrespective of any world government, I think young people can bring about change. And therefore, for the 1,700 of you, if you start planting a single tree, and if 10 people and 10 of your friends start planting it because of you, and then the effect multiplies, I think you will be arresting climate change before 193 world leaders meet. And I think sincerely that's what India's international movement to United Nations stands for. And when I see young people trying to bring about change, it just fills me with a lot of happiness, like today's session did. I hope you guys enjoyed the session. I hope you guys enjoyed the session. I pretty much did. And I look forward to seeing you this Sunday. The author series at, what was it? 6:30. 6:30. All right. Tata. Thank you. Bye.